Yes, then I'd like to start now. Okay, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for coming, and thanks to the Communist University and the Weekly Worker for inviting me. As the programme says, I'm going to talk about the transition to fully automated communism and the role of abundance. So I won't be talking about fully automated luxury communism. That's a slightly different angle. But we are heading towards the robots are coming. I'll start though with the windmill because the Greek poet Antipater greeted the windmill as the liberator of slaves. And today, after so many decades and centuries of human toil, we can kind of envision a system of fully automated communism. And obviously that term is debated. What is fully automated communism? Is fully automated communism or full automation of production actually viable, actually possible? And everyone has a slightly different take. But if we can imagine that we're working towards fully automated production, and this has happened without any intervention from communists. So as weak as our movement has been, or as small as our movement has been, this process has nevertheless proceeded unabated because of the nature of capitalism. And as Marxists argue, capitalism itself is self-abolishing. That doesn't mean we have no role to play in that, in ending the system, but it also does mean it's not just a case of capitalism ends and some other form of private property replaces it. It does actually need to be socialism, because a fully automated system of production has to be socialist, because it doesn't exploit workers anymore. It doesn't produce surplus value anymore. It doesn't produce profit anymore. And in fact, whereas a fully automated system of production, whereas a capitalist system of production is divided by competition between capitalists and divisions of labour, a fully automated system of production is singular, is non-binary. And that is why socialism or communism, the common ownership of production, becomes necessary on a global basis. So that's the future we're working towards. And a fully automated system of production would represent a higher system of communism, a developed system of communism. I agree that communism, the lower phase of communism, is when the whole economy has been taken under public ownership. And I would argue that to get to that stage, you have to have a socialist state. So I'm going to talk about the self-abolition of capitalism and how that sort of process unfolds and where we have to intervene to make the difference. So a lot of my work has been about collating empirical data that backs up Marx's economic theories. So as we all know, as Marxists, there tends to be a concentration of wealth into fewer hands, and this happens through bankruptcies and mergers and acquisitions. And so there's quite a lot of data. I won't go through all of the data, but the really big ones that stand out that really back up Marxist theory are things like almost half of all US banks having disappeared through bankruptcies and mergers since the turn of the century. So that's recent history. That's a lot. That's a lot of centralization. The same is basically true, more or less, of the major companies on the American stock market. in general. Like if you just look at the sort of Wilshire 5000 or the S&P 500, again, more or less half of all of the companies have disappeared through bankruptcies or mergers. And so we can extrapolate from that that the system is heading or tending towards. I'm not suggesting it happens in an absolute, linear way without sort of back and forth movements where there might emerge a period where there's more companies again. But the overall tendency is for this sort of ultimate concentration of industry and of the different parts of the economy into singular ownership towards a final merger. But of course, we need a socialist state to carry out that final merger, because a capitalist state, by definition, cannot expropriate itself. It might allow for some partial expropriation, like we had after or during and after World War II, but it will only allow partial expropriation, partial state ownership, when it benefits capital, when capital needs that sort of leg up to get capital accumulation going again, as was the case after World War II. Although, of course, it also had to concede ground to a relatively strong workers' movement at the time as well. So what is automation? It's a process of removing labour from the production process, eliminating labour and eliminating detailed human control of labour. And why do capitalists do this? It's to raise the productivity of labour and raise productivity in general, and accelerate capital accumulation. Because in general, as production expands and is innovated, commodities devalued, that means there tends to be less profit per commodity, and therefore you end up with an underproduction of surplus value and profit, a profitability crisis. You end up with money capital building up in money market funds and banks and offshore accounts and all that stuff that can't be reinvested profitably. And so you get the economic crisis, you get a recession, you get subsequent devaluation of capital, and then some of that money capital that's devalued because of a collapse in prices, devaluation of capital, some of it can be reinvested and accumulation can get going again. And one of the ways you get that going again is through innovating. And so the general historical tendency of production is towards more and more automated production, because you can produce more in less time, essentially. So therefore, the role of labour changes. And as an aside, it's not the most important point, but the characterisation of the move towards automation as a fourth industrial revolution is a bourgeois characterisation. It's actually the fourth technological revolution. They conflate the two. Marx would recognise it. Again, it's not the most important thing, but it's worth pointing out. Marx would recognise it as the second industrial revolution because of the radical change in the relation between technology and man. So we had manual labour dominating for a long period of human history. Then mechanisation represented the first industrial revolution, and automation represents the second industrial revolution. And of course, that's an ongoing process. One flows into the other via back and forth movements, but overall, that's the general trajectory. So humans and workers are becoming less parts of the production process per se, and more overseers, watchmen, planners. And of course, socialism is characterized largely by planning. And the more automated production has become, and the more profitability has suffered, and the more capitalists have had to offset this profitability crisis through innovation, not just of technology, but they've had to innovate organizationally as well, more and more through these mergers and acquisitions. But there are more and more planned production within their own enterprises. So production is becoming more planned as it is, again, without the intervention of communists, just because that has become more and more efficient for capitalism, for capital accumulation itself. So we can say that capitalism itself is birthing communism because mergers and acquisitions the system's becoming more and more dependent on mergers and acquisitions, which leads towards a final merger. I'm not saying that that means the revolution is around the corner. As I say, there's back and forth. I think there will be, some of these monopolies will be bought out by workers. So there will be a mix of, the core essentials once socialists have power, once we have a socialist state, there will be a mix of, things going on, different sections of society trying to do different things. I do think the socialist state will need to expropriate the commanding heights. So the core industries like, energy, food and what have you. But there probably will be, maybe even before that happens, workers, perhaps better off workers, working for the big tech companies or what have you, possibly buying out some of those types of companies. And for perhaps the first period during the socialist state, those companies will work alongside the state and there will have to be negotiations for how that plays out. But eventually, those cooperatives will need to be bought out as well, because again, they will become more productive. Perhaps it depends on certain things and the way things go, but in theory, they will become more productive and their own profitability will suffer. The law of value will still operate within essentially privately run cooperatives, and the state will need to take over those companies as well. So eventually we will have to have a fully publicly owned system of production. Now, in terms of transitioning to that, as I say, I think we need a socialist state that progressively, as and when, it will be a dynamic process. There's no absolute blueprint as to how that happens. There will be periods when the momentum is there, where the state feels strong enough to expropriate capitalists without compensation. There might be some examples of expropriation that require compensation, that smooth the process over. I'm not saying that will be always the case, but the modes of production of the past, when they have dissolved and passed into new modes of production, there has always been compensation for the old masters to some degree. Obviously, not all of them, and it varies. And obviously, some of them will reject compensation, and they will have to be expropriated without compensation. I think there will be, give and take on that side of things. So as I say, capitalism is a decaying system, and it's producing these processes on its own grounds. So what we have at the moment is an advanced but decaying state monopoly capitalism. And I think because there's an element of evolution within revolution, because it's historical, I therefore characterize the sort of transitionary state as state monopoly socialism, to try and sort of emphasize this sort of evolutionary period within the revolution, because it is a process. It is a process, a historical process, an evolutionary economic process, and an evolutionary political process. But of course, there is a revolution as well, politically and economically, all at the same time. It's, it's very complex to try and sort of precisely articulate exactly what is happening when. But of course, small historical processes erupt in revolutionary breaks at some point, and that becomes historically necessary. I think when we talk to people about, what is fully automated communism and why does that end capitalism, it's easy. For me, it's easiest to understand by looking at the economic data. Prices have tended to fall for technological goods as they've become produced in greater quantity and the more automated their productions become. And it's so, it gets to the point where the prices are so low for these technological goods that it becomes unprofitable. And alongside that, the devaluation of money has accelerated, particularly since the 1970s. You'll hear right-wing libertarians going on about, the crisis is because of the central banks printing too much money. But actually what happens is the more you produce commodities, the more money gets produced alongside it, and money gets devalued alongside it. That is just an inherent natural part of commodity expansion. So again, it's inherent to the capitalist system, and it can't ultimately be put down to the ruling class making dodgy decisions through incompetence or greed or what have you. Obviously, human action and attitudes and decision making plays a role, but they're very much sort of responding to the needs of capital accumulation. So those are two more empirical factors that I think make it really clear, alongside what I said about the mergers of banks and industry in general. And there's all sorts of other ones. Again, the falling prices. The funny thing is that I didn't bring up earlier is, about class and the sort of how difficult it is to get through to people. I think this is why these empirical presentation of these empirical facts is so important to present to people, so that they can sort of have the data and we've got so much data now, at least relatively. It sort of helps people to see where we're going, and but at the same time, it's probably become more difficult to convince people, which is why the communist movement remains small, despite this historical process that, clearly to us shows that communism is becoming an economic necessity, a historical necessity. One of the things that has sort of blurred class boundaries or class consciousness has been that households are more and more dependent on penny stocks or just investment in general. If you look at historical data over the last few decades, each decade a greater proportion of the population in the US and Britain have become investors. So it sounds like people are becoming more capitalistic. And perhaps that is influencing people's thinking, because their immediate needs are, bringing in income to pay their mortgage and so on and so forth. Obviously, pensions are heavily invested in the stock market. But at the same time, another empirical data point that is worth pointing to that counters that, the sort of dialectical movement, is that the amount of time that people invest their money in the stock market is falling towards zero. So we're coming to a point where that dependence on investment in the stock market is becoming impossible, because basically less and less time is being spent investing in it, and so that is basically in a roundabout way that time is coming to an end. So I think that with the next crisis, probably we're going to see a sort of proletarianization of what I would just call the semi-proletariat, which I think is a very large proportion of the population, particularly in the imperialist nations. So we will, again, like has been said, we will need to be able to try to talk to as many people as possible without alienating them because of kind of, you know, semi-bourgeois ideas that they perhaps presently hold. So I think that is going to be very important. So you know, again, talking to people who are questioning the system and don't know which way to turn. Again, I think this empirical data is very useful, but it's also useful to help them think about, well, you know, in the future, if you get to the stage where you can buy and own, you know, things like either individually or at sort of a community level, you know, you can own 3D printers that, you know, produce most of the products, the use values, the utilities that you want and need. Your dependence on a capitalist, you know, on going to the supermarket is severely dented. And the same is true of things like precision fermentation. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's basically lab-grown food that's advancing. Again, it cheapens production. So capitalists are actually investing in this, or at least, you know, a small but growing number of capitalists are actually investing in this sort of technology, where we are told you'll be able to grow chemically identical food in much less time with far less resources, far more cleanly, and in greater quantity than we presently do. And this is estimated to make conventional farming obsolete and unprofitable by 2035. So that's the sort of thing I think, you know, we talk about a vision, building a vision, like painting a vision and realizing and delivering this vision. That's the sort of thing you can sort of talk to people about and try to emphasize. You know, if you it's a bit like computers and phones, like they've become that. So along with the centralization of capital, there's been a decentralization of the means of consumption through laptops, printers, phones, and potentially that could happen with things like 3D printers and precision fermentation as well. But the problem is fully automated system of production, which those things fall under the category of automation, because you'd be an overseer of your 3D printer rather than, you know, a traditional labourer doing a, you know, monotonous task in the production line. Those things are automation. So fully automated system of production can't be capitalist. So what's going to happen? The capitalist system is going to collapse before we reach a fully automated system of production. It can't be capitalist, and there's no absolutely smooth transition to a fully automated system of production because capitalism cannot do it. So at the moment, for example, you know, a lot of the sort of move towards renewable energy, which is a form of automation, is hitting the buffers because it's unprofitable. It relies on subsidies from the capitalist state, it relies on the taxpayer. And, you know, brings me on to abundance, because renewable energy can provide abundant energy. If you have abundant energy, by which I mean access to, you know, all the energy that everybody needs, that's unprofitable because it's essentially free, because it's produced in such a large quantity that, as I say, because when you produce more in less time, price falls. So effectively, if you've got abundant energy, enough to produce enough for everyone and what they need, you can't make a profit out of it, you know. And again, it comes back to the devaluation of money and commodities. We're heading to the point in history where money is becoming obsolete, for example. So we were discussing, like, we need to be able to talk to people about what we're envisioning, what the system's going to look like, how it's going to work. So what's going to replace money? So obviously Marx in the critique of the Go for Profit program, talks about certificates replacing money. And today we have the technology, we've already got digital money effectively. So we have NFTs already, which are kind of like non-fungible tokens, which are kind of already like what a system of labour certificates could look like in the modern era. So we could talk about digital labour credits or what have you. So you would be paid for your time at work, and then you would spend the money you earn on your credit card, for want of another term. You then spend, so it's not that different. You want people to kind of like, you don't want to make it too hard to think about. So you want to try and relate to how things would be quite similar in some ways, because it's very like, all of this sounds like, people who haven't thought about it before, it's a lot to take in. So when you're talking about that system, so, well, you still be paid, you still go to work and you still be paid, so still be incentivized to work. We all need to work to support each other, to support societal needs. And, but of course, automation we will be trying to lower working hours, reduce retirement age, and so on and so forth, while raising living standards for all. One way that will be achieved is through the lowering of prices of goods, because as they become more automated, they will get cheaper. So there still will be prices, but it won't be money, because it won't be exchanged. So in a final merger, where you get a singular system of production, there's no exchange of ownership. So this is the other thing about the final merger. It has to be publicly owned. So that's the other thing to point out to people when you're trying to convince them. Because a total monopoly, there's no exchange of ownership in a total monopoly. So people will go to work, they will still be paid in labour vouchers, but it won't be exchanged for another commodity. So it won't be exchange of money for a commodity. It will be just not exchange, but products will be drawn down from the common market, essentially. So, and abundance is becoming important again. It is becoming discussed again. And in America, there's a book come out called Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. So people are talking about this again. And so I think it's important for communists to say abundance for whom, because their book is just called Abundance. So abundance for whom, it's very sort of vague and unambitious. And basically their definition of abundance is basically improving living standards for American people. That's basically their vague definition. And they want to achieve this through more deregulation, because they say that planning, local planning laws and environmental laws are getting in the way of building houses and high-speed rail and that sort of thing. And, to an extent that's true, because who is actually deciding the regulations? Well, it's the big monopolies who are trying to shut out competition. Fossil fuels industry has a very well known, if you've read up on it, it's very well known that they have successfully lobbied governments, and of course they themselves play roles within governments of blocking the building of nuclear energy, because again, abundant nuclear energy that is almost effectively infinite is basically unprofitable. Nuclear energy has only been successful, where there's been public ownership, essentially. And once we had the crisis of capitalism after World War II, the first big one after the 70s, we started to see a decline in the building of nuclear power plants, and to the point where it's basically stopped in most places. Obviously, France still has a lot of nuclear energy. Germany's getting rid of it almost completely, and it's only really states that still have some state ownership of energy that are pursuing the production of nuclear power plants. So regardless of what you think of nuclear energy, it does have the potential to produce abundant energy. And of course, the more we would rely on nuclear energy, if it took up more and more higher proportion of overall of energy production, of course, you'd get such cheap energy production for consumers that capitalists would have no market to sell to, because the energy would be so cheap. So this sort of like, there's this argument at the moment about, the rights lying about net zero because, they exaggerate the price of transitioning to renewable energy. And on the one hand, the people who are sort of pointing out the lies that the right is making about net zero, they're right, because obviously the costs that the right are sort of associating with it are baloney, because once you've got the renewable energy, you don't therefore need to shed out on the costs of natural gas that you would need to keep producing fossil fuels. So you'd save money that way. But it's going to become unprofitable, so it's not possible in the long run without transitioning to a system of production that's not profit motivated, that doesn't need to make a profit to produce. So again, going back to abundance for whom? Abundance for all. So my last book is called Abundant Material Wealth for All, and that is the ultimate aim of the communist movement, is to produce the capacity to provide extremely plentiful material wealth for all. And at that point, of course, you eliminate most of the, or more or less all of the divisions that we currently see in society, at least economically. And of course, culturally, there will continue to be differences that maybe fade out or become just more generally acceptable, or blah, blah, blah. But that brings up the question of climate change, because people think, rightly or understandably, people are kind of like, well, how can we still aim for abundance when, consumerism or overconsumption is destroying the planet? And this is why, again, the mode of production is so important, because we already can produce abundance, but it's an abundance of ephemeral junk at the moment that we produce, because the system is so dependent on making a profit that and reselling products to us over and over again, that it wants to make junk that doesn't last, or that it needs to upgrade, etc., so that it can keep the demand for production and capital investment and consumption repeating over and over again. But socialism, because it doesn't need to do that, because it doesn't need to make a profit, can overcome that problem. And we can make things built to last a lot longer. We can make them repairable. We can do things like having shared communal rental systems where, we don't need to make as much stuff. So you can go to the communal shed and everyone can share, the tools in there. That sort of idea, basically. And again, so it doesn't abundance for all doesn't necessarily mean, although we might have the capacity to produce as much as we want, we might actually produce less, and we probably will. Again, though, capitalism's problem is its dependence on fossil fuel. Because of this exact problem, it needs to keep reproducing and exploiting labour and selling junk to the market, to people and to other companies and institutions. That makes it dependent on fossil fuel and intensive extractive production, because that intensifies and maximizes the exploitability of labour, because it's harder to produce through extraction, more labour intensive. Even though systems become more and more capital intensive to raise the productivity of labour, the remaining labourers, the rate of exploitation of the remaining labourers increases. And of course, you end up producing more and more capital than is really necessary for production, because it's all about capital accumulation. Whereas with socialist mode of production, we could transition to what is called additive production. So rather than extraction and subtraction being, carving shapes out of material like, metal milling. That's a form of subtractive production. You could have additive production, 3D printing of which is a form, and precision fermentation, and all of those sort of newer technologies that are emerging. Again, this technological revolution is playing as big a role as the sort of economic decay of capitalism itself. They're obviously very closely linked, or not, more than closely linked, they're totally entwined. And so your additive production, you're adding layers and shaping layers out of material in the way that you want, as you would see with a 3D printer, for example. Data is additive, you're adding to the process. So that gives us the ability to transition to non-extractive forms of production. I'm not saying that we would immediately ban metal mining and fossil fuel production, but we could start to build up industries that are additive. And there are two materials in particular that have stood out to me in my research. There's probably a lot more, but the two are hemp, which humanity has used for thousands of years. Even in the earlier stages of capitalism, it was really sort of the emergence of US imperialism that really severely curtailed the use of hemp in industrial production. Because of its cheapness and versatility, it was a threat to fossil fuels, the chemicals industry, the paper industry, and so on and so forth. There are over 50,000 applications that are already used in the hemp industry, but on a small scale at the moment. But it can do a lot of things. It can replace a lot of things that are presently made out of fossil plastics. So you could have bioplastics, buildings made out of hemp that are, far superior in terms of insulation. Obviously can't be used in every country around the world, but that's just an example. Lots of exciting possibilities. And then there's mycelium, and I've just watched a video on how there's a mycelium revolution already happening. Again, this is part of the automation revolution. There are, on a small scale, there are companies that are starting to produce, leather, certain types of food, surfboards. I mean, it's very, very versatile, and very exciting in terms of the possibilities of, again, replacing fossil plastics that, presently pollute the land, the sea, the air, human bodies, and warm the climate at an alarming rate. Of course, hemp is biodegradable, mycelium is biodegradable, and that would solve the plastic problem, and of course, we'd be producing with far less emissions. So I think that is, when we're talking about envisaging and painting a future, again, it's difficult because, I've proposed that we have a manifesto called Abundant Material Wealth for All. I accept that is difficult because it's promising a lot. And one criticism of my approach is obviously you're promising too much, and it's some sort of minimal program is absolutely necessary. And I've tried to incorporate something like that in the 12-point plan that I outline in this book, like stuff like cancel all mortgages, so that people don't think that we're going to come along and take their housing from them. What we're going to do is liberate them from having to pay a mortgage, for example. That's, so we want a program that's immediately appealing, cancelable debt, all personal debt and stuff like that. But yeah, we want our sort of early stage program to be as appealing to a broadest possible range. We have to remember that there's a proletarianization of, a deepening proletarianization of people who are already working class. There's a proletarianization of the semi-proletariat, and then there's a proletarianization of, petty producers, and even, some, monopoly capitalists will probably go bust, and so on and so forth. So we have to bear in mind that it's a process. And I think the point I'm trying to make is that a class is a little bit more fluid than perhaps we tend to think of it. And it's just, we have to bear that in mind and, make our appeal the most appealing, in terms of what we're trying to offer at the start. But it's then also worth saying to people and pointing out to people that socialism is a process of building a system that can provide abundant material wealth for all, which I then think appeals to those downwardly mobile sections from, the people who are presently happy with the system, who might not be in a few years or a few decades time. I can't tell you exactly when all this is going to exactly unfold. So yeah, because I think, again, just to emphasize that point, I think it's the point about abundance is important to try and disalienate as broad a proportion of that section of downwardly mobile middle class or small capitalists, or even some of the the bigger capitalists who might be open. And I think some of them might be eventually open to defection, because they are emotionally attached to seeing automation succeed, because that's been what they've devoted a lot of their time to. So it's worth bearing things in like that in mind as well. Obviously, it won't work on a lot of them because of the obvious. But yeah, so that's basically it. As I say, capitalism is self-immolating, but it's also producing a new economic technical basis, whereby we're moving from what I would say is like the mechanized commodity towards the automated utility, I suppose, that as a sort of economic foundation of the economic system. That makes capitalism increasingly obsolete. It makes a singular, non-competitive or post-competitive mode of production necessary, which is socialism, the common ownership of production and the economy. And yeah, we need a socialist state to see that process through, and then we can move towards a post-extractive mode of producing and a clean mode of production that saves the planet, raises living standards for all, and moves towards that system of abundant material wealth for all.